Hey there, Quantumites. Bodie Morningway here from Quantum Comics, your friendly neighborhood comic book store where adventure awaits. That's right. It is time for another episode of Coffee and Comic Books. And today, good old Stan and I are going to talk a little bit about this dude right here, Spider-Man. I'm sure you've heard of him. You know, he's had a couple of movies and some nominal success in comic books and action figures and television shows, costumes, books, as in novels, you know, lots of stuff. Anyways, here's a fun little story about Spider-Man. And this has been told by Stan a few times, and I'm going to attempt to tell it. Of course, I won't be able to tell it with as much panache as the man here, but yeah, I'll give it my little 2 cents, I suppose. But Spider-Man almost did not come into being. In fact, when Stan first took the idea of Spider-Man to his editor did not like it at all. I mean, first of all, he says, it's a spider. People hate spiders, Stan. Why would you want to name a hero after a spider? There's got to be a villain because they hate spiders, so they're going to hate this guy. We can't have a hero that's named after a spider, that has spider powers. Yuck, that's gross. And then Stan wanted to make him, of course, a teenager with teenager problems, right? His editor didn't like that either because before, at this time, when Stan was throwing around this idea, teenagers were only sidekicks, right? So his editor naturally is saying, well, you can't have him be a kid. I mean, nobody wants to read about a kid as a main character, as a sidekick, sure, but as a main character, no way. And you want to make it a full costume where he's all covered up so you can't tell who he is or anything? Nah, that's never going to work. So unfortunately, you know, Stan was pretty dejected, and his idea was shot down because his editor just didn't think Spider-Man is going to be a good idea. But Stan was working on this one magazine called Amazing Fantasy. And they had decided to cancel this series with the last issue, which was going to be number 15. So Stan talked it over with his wife. I believe her name was Joni, one of those, I think. And she suggested, well, if they're going to cancel the magazine anyway, why don't you just put it in there? And so Stan thought, and was like, okay, you know, why not? What have I got to lose, right? So he hired out the artists. At the time, he went to both Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. Decided to go with Steve Ditko's version of it because it was a little bit less super heroic like Jack Kirby did. He's always been very over the top muscles and everything, right? So Stan didn't quite want that image for Spider-Man. He wanted more of a gangly look, and Ditko had what he wanted. So he opted for him. They put the story in Amazing Fantasy number 15, and back in those days, you didn't get notice of just how popular a comic was for several weeks. It wasn't like an immediate overnight thing like it is these days. So he actually apparently forgot about it. And then suddenly his editor comes up to him one day and says, Stan, remember that great idea you had about that Spider-Man? Well, it's a hit. I'm so glad I let you print it. Of course, you know, with Stan Lee, if you watch his interviews, which I highly suggest you do because he's a very, very brilliant and elegant speaker. Far, far better than I could ever be. Anyways, he tells it wonderfully, and it's just absolutely hilarious. But I mean, Spider-Man is one of the first heroes that most kids, including myself, recognize. For me, I think it was likely the old Spider-Man TV show, you know, with the theme song of Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. I'm pretty sure that one of my earliest memories is watching that show and just, you know, rolling around on the couch and doing my own little itty-bitty Bodie version of Spider-Man all over the place and driving my parents crazy, of course, because, well, yeah, you know, parents, right? I say that now because I am one. But nonetheless, Spider-Man has had tons of success with comic books. Of course, after Steve Ditko did the initial Spider-Man drawings, you had John Romita that took over, and then you have an even more heroic Spider-Man introducing characters like the Vulture and Kingpin, and really classic, wonderful Spider-Man art like that. Great, great stuff. And then it continues on through the 80s, and you have, here's actually an homage to Action Comics #1, which is kind of funny because in my mind, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, Spider-Man and Superman, they're one of the first ones that I recall ever recognizing. And this is a Todd McFarlane issue. This is where Spider-Man's black costume comes into play, which, of course, if you know your Spider-Man lore, ends up becoming the alien symbiote Venom. And, of course, Todd McFarlane was also very much influential with his artwork. His is a very, very intriguing work where he twists and turns his characters far more than anybody else. Because if you compare that to, let's say, the John Romita Classic, where Spidey is not really angled as much, that's something that Todd McFarlane did. And of course, Todd McFarlane is from Canada, so that's a Canadian artist right there. And we have also, of course, massive tomes of Spider-Man, such as this one here, a lot of the classic early works. If you look on the back, you can see all those wonderful comics in there. But another thing that makes a great villain, or sorry, not a great villain, a great hero, are the villains that they come into contact with. And of course, Spider-Man has one of the most recognizable rogues galleries that you will ever see, from characters like the Green Goblin to the Rhino, Dr. Octopus, the Kingpin, the Chameleon, Kraven the Hunter, the Jackal, Venom, Hobgoblin. I mean, you can go on and on. These are exceptional characters. Of course, you've got guys like Mysterio as well. You've got the Enforcers. Just amazing, amazing characters. And then, of course, you've got the supporting characters like J. Jonah Jameson, who spends half his time being villain and half his time being, well, no, most of his time really being villain, right? Because it's JJJ. Always ranting about Spider-Man, always thinking that Spider-Man is the one behind everything, right? Interestingly enough, in the newer comics, he starts to become a fan of Spider-Man. So that really turns things on its edges. The newest series of Spider-Man, this is the first trade paperback. It is actually entitled Back to Basics. It's very fun, very good actually for all ages, is this book. So I would highly recommend that. But that is it for another episode of Coffee and Comic Books. This is Bodie Morningway signing off because it's morphin' time! So long, Space Cowboys.